Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Open University.
John Dryden's classification of translation. John Dryden was the greatest English poet of the second half of the 17th century. He was also its principal and most influential translator, as well as the leading commentator on the art of translation. Though he did translate a number of prose works, his most celebrated translations are of verse and mostly of the ancient Greek and Roman poetry. Dryden is described as a theorist of translation. However, such a classification is potentially misleading for those who think that it means his being the author of an original, comprehensive, and static body of any doctrine on translation, and that it was determined in advance and consistently put into practice by him and others. Dryden's writings on translation are more properly thought of as a constantly revolving set of programmatic statements and reflections. They are his developing further of the works of his predecessors. They are composed over 2 decades as a working translator. They derive their authority as much from the poet's practice as from their cogency in the abstract. All the major statements on translation by Dryden occur in his prefaces or dedications attached to his particular works of collections. For example, Ovid's Epistles, Sylvae, the Satires of Juvenal and Persius, Examen Poeticum, Virgil's Aeneis, Fables Ancient and Modern, and the works of Lucian, published posthumously in 1711. Dryden's prefaces speak about a number of large questions of the act of translation. These questions are: what kind of knowledge and experience, that is scholarly, artistic, or human, a translator should possess? How much and what sort of fidelity to the original text he should show? How can he best preserve the distinctive character and spirit of the original? Should he reproduce the original author's vices as well as his virtues? Should the translator update the manners, customs, and beliefs of his source text to make them more accessible to the audience for whom he translates? What kinds of pleasure a translator must seek to cater to his readers? These are all very pertinent questions regarding translation. What is of special interest for us is Dryden's classification of translation in it. In the preface to Ovid's Epistle, the poet proposed his celebrated tripartite division of translation. They are metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation. Metaphrase refers to rendering of an author word for word and line by line from one language into another. Paraphrase implies translation with latitude. In this, the author is kept in view by the translator in such a way that he is never lost. No doubt, his words are not so strictly followed as his sense. The authorial message is admitted to be amplified but not altered. The third category of imitation refers to the fact that in it the translator takes the liberty not only to deviate from the words and sense, but also to forsake them both if required. It proposes to taking only some general hints from the original and rewriting of it as the translator feels. Paraphrase, which was the chosen method of Dryden and his fellow contributors to Ovid's epistles, is offered as an ideal via media between the two unacceptable extremes. Dryden broadly adhered to the paraphrastic style of translation for the rest of his translating career. Nevertheless, He was always prepared to incorporate into his translations the elements of metaphrase and imitation, both depending on what was called for by the particular task at hand then. Wentworth Dillon, the fourth Earl of Roscommon, provided an important stimulus to Dryden's developing thought about translation in the years immediately following Ovid's epistles. It was Roscommon's essay on translated verse, which was, in a way, the byproduct or the manifesto of the academy that he had established to encourage the refining of the English language without abating the force of it by enriching the native literary tradition through translation. It was also he who saw Dryden as the natural leader of the new generation of translator poets his academy had sought to encourage. Ovid's epistles can, in many ways, be marked as a turning point in John Dryden's literary career. However, the craze for heroic drama was starting to fade, and Dryden was to find in the practice of translation a new outlet for his poetical and critical activities, as well as the fulfillment of his lifelong engagement with classical texts. Ovid's epistles also marks the beginning of Dryden's late and prolific career as a translator of the classics. Dryden's refashioning of himself as a literary translator coincides with the renewal of the activities of the translation of the classical literatures in the Augustan England. By the second half of the 17th century, English translations of the most of the classical authors were by and large available. Some of these translations were made by the renowned poets, or they were available in lavish illustrated editions. Through the examples set by Johnson, Sandys, and May, and later by Waller and Denham, the practice of translation or retranslation of the classical texts had been established as a way to appropriate the authority of the classical authors and also to offer oblique comments on the then current political, religious, or aesthetic issues of England. A few months before Dryden wrote his preface, the Earl of Roscommon published a new translation of Horace's Art of Poetry, in which he explicitly challenged the translation methods and the literary taste exemplified by Ben Jonson's earlier version of the poem. Dryden's enthusiastic response to Roscommon in the preface to Ovid's epistles also constitutes a theoretical counterpart to Roscommon's Art of Poetry. The themes and issues articulated in this text can be described as forming the basis of Dryden's reflection on translation and establishing the main tenets of Augustan translation discourse. Yet, the significance of the preface to Ovid's epistles in the history of English translation remains undisputed. Dryden's reputation as the first English translation theorist has only recently come into question. While George Steiner interprets Dryden's programmatic preface in terms of the claims of theory advanced by 17th century English translators, more recent critics have presented it as a collection of pragmatic ad hoc notes on the practice of literary translation. Similarly, some historians of translation have challenged the novelty of Dryden's threefold approach to translation. Even his views on the distinction between metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation have also been traced to the sources as distant and varied as Philo-Judaeus, Quintilian, Lawrence Humphrey, Roger Escham, and Pierre Daniel Hewitt. One should examine the conditions of the production of a text of translation, that is, the social, critical, and literary networks in which the translator is involved at that time. Dryden's contribution to the contemporary debates on translation and literary criticism, as well as the relationship between his work and the 17th century literary markets and reading practices do define the place of Dryden's preface in the Augustan culture of translation and re-evaluate its significance to English translation history. As regards the Ovid's epistles, the genre of the heroic epistle proves an especially favorable ground for the poets previously associated with the theatre like Dryden, who contributed 3 of the 23 translations, Canes to Macarius, Helen to Paris, Dido to Innis. At first sight, Dryden's preface to Ovid's epistles follows the format established by the 16th and the 17th century classical translations. After providing biographical information on Ovid, Dryden proceeds to examine his poetry and ends with an apology of his own translation principles. Dryden has published several formal treatises in the 1670s, yet he seemed to view prefaces as privileged ground for the discussion of literary and aesthetic issues, and he carried out practice into his translation too. Apart from the famous distinction between metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation, what has attracted most critical attention in Ovid's epistles is Dryden's stress on preserving the character of the author. Judith Sloman interprets this concern as an effect of Dryden's Neoplatonic approach to translation, according to which aesthetic ideas can equally be expressed in different languages. According to T.R. Steiner, Dryden is an heir to Aristotle's conception of mimesis, according to which the models for artistic representation, here poetic translation, are identified through a process of analytical abstraction, in which the specific analyzable qualities of the source are isolated and defined. If Dryden's prescriptive normative comments on translation may perhaps fall short of theory, one can certainly recognize in them the habits of thought of Dryden the critic. As has been noted by many translation historians, Dryden's use of the terms metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation follows a long tradition in translation theory. In his Institutio Oratoria, Quintilian distinguishes between the pedagogical exercise of metaphrase, where literary models are rewritten one word at a time, and that of paraphrase, where original texts are reworked on a line by line basis. In the English tradition, the rhetorical distinction established by Quintilian was used by Lawrence Humphrey, whose 1559 treatise Interpretatio Linguarum guides translators to follow a middle way between the extremes of a rough word for word translation and of a loose and licentious rendering of the text. Quintilian's definitions also provided the basis for Roger Escham's discussions of paraphrase and metaphrase as specific pedagogical practices. However, while Escham and Humphrey were mainly concerned with ways of rewriting the classics from one ancient language into the other, Dryden's appropriation of these traditional terms rather echoes Pierre Daniel Hewitt's influential The Interpretation. Like Hewitt, Dryden uses quintillions distinction between word for word rendition and looser forms of translation, as well as the commonplace reference to Horace's art of poetry as a way to relate his own practice of free translation to the classical discourse on literary emulation. However rooted in classical precedents, Dryden's famous distinction may be it would be a mistake to separate Dryden's discourse on translation from the literary culture of the times. The context of production of Ovid's epistles and its format suggest that one should read Dryden's tripartite definition of translation not as an absolute taxonomy but rather as an invitation to compare between different manners of translation according to the very genre of miscellany. Besides, Dryden's discussion of the most appropriate way of translation is best understood in the context of the Augustan debate on paraphrase and imitation. Denham's method of free translation was widely accepted when Dryden wrote his preface. Yet, in 1676, Rochester's allusion to Horace gave a whole new meaning to Denham's commonplace statement by offering a free rewriting of Horace's satires that transferred their time and place to Restoration London. Underlying Dryden's description of imitation as an abusive form of rewriting was also the fact that the protean genre of the imitation encompassed the rude and subversive travesties of the classics that mutilated in Restoration England after Charles Cotton's 1664 Virgil travesty. By offering a clear, although flexible distinction between translation with latitude and more libertine versions of the classics, Dryden obviously seeks to distinguish the paraphrase and imitations offered in Ovid's epistles from such disreputable forms of rewriting. As Dryden openly admits in the preface, his approach to translation is freer than his own definition of paraphrase would admit, although his three contributions to the miscellany are almost equal in length to their originals. They omit or expand many Ovidian lines. Dryden's variations from the source text are partly explained by the fact that the 17th century translator was expected to interpret the text as much as to offer a literary equivalent to it. The transformation of Ovid's elegiac epistles into tragic soliloquies may, of course, be linked to Dryden's own practices as a playwright. Thank you very much.
स्वाध्यायः